Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along. I'm delighted that we're joined this morning by Professor Juliet Osborne from the University of Exeter. Juliet is a well-known bee biologist, so over to Juliet to explain about her talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you. And thank you, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the BBKA for inviting me, and thank you to the CB Dennis Trust who are sponsoring a lot of the research-based lectures at this conference. So I'm going slightly out of my comfort zone today. This is the first talk I've given on social science. I'm a bee ecologist, and I study the behaviour of bees mostly and have done for 30 years. And I'm sort of turning the spotlight onto the behaviour of humans in this particular talk. So hopefully you enjoy it. It might create some conversation, some debate, and you might not agree with everything that comes out of it, but let's see how we go. There is an anonymous audience survey. If any of you want to do it on your phone, it's relatively quick, and I'm going to present the results at the end, hopefully, if the technology works. Okay. So, yes, I'm in the Environment and Sustainability Institute, which is the University of Exeter, but it's down on the Cornwall campus. So I'm based down near Falmouth, working with my team of postdocs and PhD students. And that's the building there on the right. And most of our work is about the behaviour and ecology of pollinators, mostly bees, understanding and conserving wild and managed pollinator populations, and protecting and promoting pollination of wild plants and crops. And of course, being based in Cornwall means it's a haven for wild bees, some of our rarer species down there, but also for a vibrant community of beekeepers who are going to be the subjects of some of the Cornwall and Devon beekeepers are the subject of some of the results I'm going to show you. This slide just shows the research projects we've got going at the moment. The three at the top I talked about yesterday, and how we're changing the scene for pollinators in Cornwall, and that's about working with a lot of landowners, businesses and Cornwall Council to improve green spaces across the board for pollinators and other biodiversity. We have a lot of work going on the Asian hornet at the moment with Dr. Pete Kennedy and others, which I'm not talking about today, but if anyone wants to ask me about that later, that's absolutely fine. What I'm going to talk about today particularly is the beekeeping motivations with Faye Kahani, who's a new PhD student working with me, and some work of Ben Phillips and Jess Knapp, who also looked at the public's engagement with pollination. So we made this slide many years ago, really, about all the different factors which might cause stress on honeybee colonies and also wild bee colonies. And they take into account a lot of the sort of the weather and the biological factors and the environmental factors. And I think in terms of farming practices and beekeeping at that point, we were talking about the practices, what you put in your hive or take out of your hive, or what farmers put on the land or take out of the land. But what we didn't include in this diagram, which we thought was the holistic picture, was actually the human motivations and behaviours behind those practices. Why do farmers do what they do? Why do people do what they do? Or why do beekeepers do what they do? What's behind their motivations to do that? Not so that we can change what they're doing necessarily, but to open up the debate about this amazing diversity of beekeepers that we have in this country in particular. And that's the social science bit. As I said, there is the anonymous audience survey. The passcode is there. It's very simple. It's completely anonymous. I don't get a data set afterwards saying what people have answered or anything. All I get is the bar chart that you're going to see, hopefully, at the end. And the 5 questions are, how many honeybee colonies do you keep? And there's an option for those who don't have any bee colonies, that's fine. How long have you been beekeeping? Do you manage your colonies to control Varroa? And that could be in a chemical way, it could be by drone culling or any other method that you might use. And then the other 2 questions are about your motivations for keeping honeybees. And you can choose to rank any of those options. There may be options that I've not included there, but you can choose from these ones and we can discuss those at the end. And the 5th question, I've only let you pick one of these 3 things. What do you prioritise in your beekeeping? Is the goal colony productivity? Is it the health and survival of the bee colonies? Or is it the long-term conservation of honeybee populations? And you'll see why I've set the questions in this way at the end, hopefully. So, what we're going to talk about today, the short title of the talk being Who Cares About Bees and Why? I'm going to start with the work of Jess Knapps and Ben Phillips, who are previous PhD students, me now both working as academics in the field as well. Motivations behind why people take action to conserve pollinators. Then I'm going to move on to the beekeeper study, and then the results from any audience members who've participated. And then a final slide on what is, or what sustainable beekeeping could mean, or does mean, to people. And that's really to open up the questions. I'm certainly not going to give you the answers to that, because it's not my place to do so. I don't keep bees. My husband, Dr. P. Kennedy, is a beekeeper of, 30 odd years. And so he's been through this talk. He's said it's okay and it's not going to upset too many people, so good. Although he's decided not to come this weekend. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe he thinks I will. Okay, so Jess and Ben's study, Knapp and Phillips, published in 2020, was about looking at motivations for people taking pollinator action. And I think we're all aware that the public awareness of bees and pollination has increased dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. Here's just one graph which shows the appearance of bees and or pollinator decline and or bee decline in the UK's national newspaper articles. And you can see how that ramped up. And part of that is absolutely down to beekeepers' activism, I would say, in this area, as well as the sort of more environmental conversations. So it's massively increased. And most people, and certainly most young people and children, have heard that bees are declining across the globe. But what they understand by that is fairly varied, I would say. And we know, certainly from the NBU's bee base, that beekeeper numbers have increased over 10 years, from 16,000 to 42,000, and those are just the ones on bee base. So that's suggesting beekeepers are doubling. Well, don't take the absolute figures there, because we know there's a lot of beekeepers who aren't necessarily on bee base, but it probably means beekeepers in this country have about doubled. I don't know, I haven't got the BBKA figures, Joyce thinks not, but that's fine. But we know it's gone up. What's interesting about the global perspective on pollinator populations, and if you really want the detail on this, I suggest you go to the IPBES publication, International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, simple to trip off the tongue, which is equivalent to the sort of IPCC Climate Change Intergovernmental Panel. They have all the data and figures on population changes as we know them, or where the data exists, and we certainly know that wild pollinators, bumblebees, solitary bees, butterflies and moths, and hoverflies have declined, yes, in Europe and in lots of other parts of the world. But we also know that domesticated honeybee stocks have massively increased across the globe. It totally varies in different countries, but across the globe there has been an increase in stocks. So I think the average non-beekeeper, probably on the street, wouldn't necessarily be aware of that sort of difference, if you like, between wild pollinators, whether those are honeybees or other insects, and managed stocks. And of course, there are thousands of public campaigns about pollinators, and saving the bees is one of the mantras of our time, I would say. So how does this increased awareness and enthusiasm, absolute enthusiasm, actually translate into pollinator conservation action on the ground, is the question we were trying to ask with this survey. So Jess and Ben put together this survey together with one of my other PhD students, Jen Clements, who is a social scientist, and Ros Shaw, who's a postdoc who's worked with me for many years, looking at the socio-psychological factors beyond knowledge that predict people's engagement with pollinator conservation. That's the paper article. That's openly available if anyone wants to get into the detail of it. Despite extensive ecological research on pollinator declines, almost no social research has been done assessing the drivers of people's engagement with that pollinator conservation. So we wanted to try and look at that gap, really. And so they did it with an online survey. There's a little picture on the left of the sort of the front page when we set the survey up. The aims were to understand the range of factors such as their attitude to pollinators and conservation of pollinators, their knowledge, how they identified themselves, and how that affects people's engagement in pollinator conservation. When do they take action, and what actions do they take? I should have said that all of this work that I'm presenting in this lecture has been funded by the Halpin Trust, which have been a super important funder for some of our work, which is much more difficult to get through the major funders in the UK. The Halpin Trust are very good at wanting to do something a little bit different. So the online questionnaire, we received 1,275 responses, which was great. which is widely distributed. There were 26 questions, which either had yes or no answers. They were multiple choice, or they had a Likert scale, 7-point, which is where you say you strongly agree, you don't really care, you disagree, or you know, that sort of question. But there were also free text comment boxes for people to comment on what they thought. And we expected the bias of participants to be those interested in pollinators. Those are the people who are going to click the button and actually do the survey, and those with internet skills who can do this and are happy with the technology to do this. Just looking at the proportion of people, or the different people that were represented in the participants, 83% of them owned gardens, 15% of them were beekeepers, in fact. Some of them managed allotments, some of them had none. There were 8% owned or managed farmland. What's that one? Business owners of outdoor premises. So this just gives you a sort of look at the shape of the audience, if you like. But I'm not going to split that out in the results here. So in terms of those 26 questions we asked, they were sort of based on the social science behind this, and they were looking at 3 different areas, which were people's perceptions, which covered the, and it's all based on something called the theory of planned behaviour, which I'm not going to go into in more detail, but if you want more detail, it's in the paper. So it's their attitude to pollinators, or their attitude to pollinator conservation, the social pressure they feel to do something about pollinators, and their perceived ability to take action. How easy do they find it, or they think it is to take action? Then their knowledge, we tested that with some clear, you know, what sort of bee is this, or what sort of insect is this? Knowledge about pollinators, knowledge about pollinator conservation, and then their identity. And this could have been all sorts of things, but we looked at their frequency of interacting with nature, how connected to nature they feel, whether they identify as an environmentalist, and lots of things about their socio-demography, how old they are, gender, employment status. And the question is, which of these factors are most likely to predict whether people actually take pollinator conservation actions? And the list of pollinator conservation actions that we surveyed as to whether they took these here. So what you might expect, do they mow infrequently? Do they leave flowering weeds? Do they leave bare ground or create wildflower meadows? Some interesting ones there that you might think, well, actually, what difference does this really make to pollinators? So do they feed sugar water if they find a bee lying on their drive? Do they sign petitions, avoid chemicals? And so, having found out about the people, do they take any of these actions, basically? And so our responses were analysed to see which of the social factors in the last slide predicted either the total number of these conservation actions that were taken or the likelihood of taking each of those individual actions. So here's an example of some results, and I'm not expecting you to read all the text on the left, but it's true, as we expected, most respondents held strong and positive attitudes towards pollinators. You can see that here at the top. Pollinators are very important to me. 96% strongly agreed with that. I find pollinators interesting. So we are a subset of self-chosen people, if you like, in the population that we're choosing. The one they disagree with is actually because of the way that we framed it. The question was, nothing that I do for pollinators will make a difference. And they disagreed with that, suggesting that a lot of them felt that they could make a difference. So these are their attitudes at the top. This is about social norms. Do they feel any social pressure to do anything? And there's a bit more mixed responses, actually. People expect me to do things for pollinators, agreeing and disagreeing, and so forth. And then this bottom category, and these are just in examples, are whether people feel they have the ability to help. So their perceived behavioural control is called in the techno jargon. I'm confident that I can do things to help pollinators was quite well, and they disagreed that it was difficult. So most of them agreed they could do something, but again, mixed responses. So these graphs show which of all of those factors that I showed in the previous slide actually had a significant effect on the number of pollinator conservation actions undertaken. So for each little box, the blue, they're called sunflower plots, and the sort of shape and size of these relates to how many people answer the question there. So if they're big blue dots, it means more people answer the question here. And we're going from strongly agreeing and disagreeing at the left. And on the y-axis, up the side, is the number of actions that they took. And these are the important factors. The most important 3 were these that made the biggest difference to whether they actually took action. The most, and I'm going to take the others out because it's simpler to look at the slide. The first one, and I know you can't read all of that, well, I can't read all of those actually, is the most important thing was the diversity of nature interactions that that person was engaged in the rest of their life, if you like. So whether they watched or listened to nature programs, they looked at books, they went out and enjoyed nature and scenery, they did a bit of watching of wildlife. So this diversity of nature interactions was the best predictor of whether they would really take pollinator action. The second was their perceived ability to help. So if they were confident they could do things to help pollinators, if it wasn't difficult for them to help pollinators at home, and if it wasn't difficult for them to help pollinators at work. So we've got sort of double negative going on there. And the third one was their attitude, if they found pollinators interesting or important. Interestingly, what I've cut out of here is, whilst knowledge of pollinators and pollinator actions was important, it wasn't nearly as important as whether they engaged with nature generally. Which, as sort of scientists who are always trying to push as much knowledge out there as important, is really important for us to reflect on, I think. So just going through those findings, interaction with nature was important and a significant predictor of all pollinator conservation actions, and attitude towards pollinator, or their care for pollinators, was important. No surprises. And actually, it kind of brings me back to this point about whether people will feed an individual bee with sugar water, because, you know, my knowledge as an ecologist or understanding bee populations will say there isn't really any point in feeding that individual bee, except possibly if it's a queen bumblebee in the spring who's found a nest and has pollen. Anyway, but mostly that is something that shows people will care about these pollinators, and they care for that bee, which is much more likely to result in them taking other pollinator actions, even if ecologically it doesn't mean they're going to save the bee population by doing that particular action, if you see what I mean. So that's an important learning, I think. And the action that we can take is actually not necessarily about telling them more about bees or what they could do better, but inspiring and empowering people to care about nature more generally, right from those early days. That's the most important thing that's going to affect action in the long term. Their perceived ability to help pollinators was important and significant. And this slide, sort of result here is interesting, because it asks, to what extent do you agree or disagree that these groups of people are responsible for protecting pollinators? And it goes down so that actually the ones, they all highly agree that national governments are the most, are really important in protecting pollinators. And it sort of goes down in scale, and householders are at the bottom of this and have more people saying, well, it's actually possibly, we don't really agree very much with that statement. So they're all agreeing with the statement that governments and landowners and farmers can make a difference, but they're not all agreeing that they can make a difference or that businesses can make a difference. Okay, so that's about scale, but it's also about whether people feel it is their responsibility to do anything. So maybe there's something we can do there to show that actually individuals can make a difference at a scale that's relevant. And also this question asks, to what extent do the following items prevent you from doing more for pollinators? So just look at the ones at the top. The things that were preventing people taking action were lack of time, lack of knowledge, and lack of space. Okay? So there were various other things that didn't really matter very much. So we need to suggest actions, if we would like people to take more action to conserve pollinators, that deal with those challenges of time, space, and, interestingly, knowledge, although it didn't come out as a significant factor. So the action is about building confidence that they can do something about this one on the left, that they as householders or small businesses can do something to affect change, and to overcome those barriers that reduces the chances of people conserving pollinators. So back to this knowledge question. Knowledge was less important than people's perceptions and attitudes and interactions with nature in whether they actually took action or not. But also, many people didn't carry out pollinator conservation actions that they knew would help. It highlights this knowledge-action gap, and this is a really well-known phenomenon, actually, in conservation science, that you can push as much knowledge out there as you like. You can have as much detailed knowledge over as wide a scale as possible, but sometimes it just doesn't translate into the right amount of action that makes enough change on the ground. And we can all see it now, right, with the climate change debate and the biodiversity crisis. How many scientists are banging on the television about how catastrophic it is, but actually whether it results in action. So this knowledge-action gap is well known and appears to be the case here as well. And this is actually about a lesson to us as scientists as well as others, or knowledgeable people, that ensure that that knowledge isn't necessarily too theoretical or too general, make it really easy to apply. That's the important thing. It's not all about the research. Never thought I'd be saying that in a public space. Okay. Interestingly, several simple, low-cost pollinator conservation actions were very underutilised. So this is about things that people could do with small spaces without much time and doesn't cost any money. So you're getting over those barriers that I talked about a moment ago. And knowledge was more important when we did the individual analysis of these less well-known actions. So things like creating bare ground for solitary bees, or leaving flowering weeds actually, and mowing less. People were doing less than we expected. They didn't have the knowledge, or they didn't necessarily know, the general public who answered these questions anyway. The truth is, the way that our, this is sort of technical detail, but the way the survey was set up, or the questions asked, was we measured their explicit knowledge, what they knew about pollinators from questions about bees, multiple choice questions. We didn't measure what we call their tacit knowledge, or their experience-based knowledge. And this is going to come up again in the kind of beekeeper study that I mentioned in a moment. And these different forms of knowledge being super important. That there's fact-based knowledge, which some of us as scientists are quite good at getting across. There's experience-based knowledge, and there's that intuitive knowledge that you grow up learning and knowing, basically. And I don't think we pay enough attention to those sometimes when we're creating policy and expecting people to do things. So summarising this particular study, and then I'll move on to the beekeepers, it is about how inspiring people and empowering people to care and take more responsibility for their local environment is likely to increase pollinator conservation. So environmental education is starting earlier. This is a quote, and I can't remember who it came from. I think it was someone in Cornwall Council. I used it yesterday as well. And it's not necessarily about taking everyone out to nature reserves or showing them the rare birds or the orchids. It's about everyday nature for people every day, being able to go outside the house and just on a bit of scrappy grass, seeing a small tortoiseshell butterfly, and from the age of 2, 3, 4, 5, and actually helping people to observe that from a very early age and ingraining it, if you like, in their everyday world. Community programs facilitate public interest in the involvement of management of green space, so they don't need to own that space and it doesn't need to cost them money. It might just cost them a bit of time if they get involved in community initiatives, but it gets over some of those barriers. So feeling able to help, strategies needed to overcome what people believe prevents them from conserving pollinators, and free resources and communicating those simple beneficial actions. And of course, this is something that we know that beekeepers do extremely well in all of your outreach, and when you go out to all, well, before the pandemic, I guess, all of the local shows, regional shows, national shows, where you're communicating that information very effectively. Targeted knowledge can encourage people to carry out those actions which, interesting, conflict with dominant social norms. So this is about mowing, actually. There's a dominant social norm that mowing is a good thing, and neatness and green, tidy lawns is a good thing. But knowledge can help get over those social norms to help people think that actually it's okay to leave grass long and so forth, consequently, more flowers. Okay, so that was a bit about who cares about bees in terms of the public and why they do, and when they take action. And let's move on to the beekeepers now, and the motivations behind beekeeping practice. So this is a case study, again funded by the Halpin Trust, which Faye Kahani here on the top right undertook for us, and she's now just starting a PhD. She's doing a Master's by Research with me at the moment. She starts her PhD this year to take this work a lot further, and it really was, because this was a case study in a small part of the southwest of England. We know beekeepers are crucial to honeybee health in the UK. We know they're important for connecting and spreading the knowledge as well. There's a huge diversity of beekeeping practices, and sometimes that can lead to debate or even potentially conflict, actually. Down in the southwest, there's quite a lot of politics involved in beekeeping. And we're not here to tell people how to do it right, but I think it's interesting to look at that range as respectfully as we can. And Ros Shaw, Sarah Crowley, and of course Pete Kennedy were involved in this study as well. And there's a rise in the idea of the concept of sustainable beekeeping, but everyone has a different thought about what that actually means, I think. So some of our questions were sort of trying to get underneath that without asking that question directly, to think about what people think is most important about beekeeping for them. So we framed it in this way, to understand why beekeepers do what they do. Because I've spent 30 years asking why bees do what they do. So we thought we'd turn it around a little bit. Understanding the diverse motivations, investigating their motivations and how they underpin management, and we used inspections, frequency of hive inspection, Varroa treatment and swarm control as the questions on that, and collaboratively exploring what sustainable beekeeping might mean. Case study in the southwest of England used a social science technique called Q methodology, which I wasn't aware of before, described as a scientific study of subjectivity. So this is a really nice social science study, which isn't just about interviewing people and understanding the themes of what they've talked to you about, which for a sort of more ecological scientist can be quite difficult because there's no numbers involved. Q methodology is good because it does both. It has a lot of words, but it also can turn those into numbers so you can get some graphs out of the end of it as well. So it's qualitative and it's quantitative. And your diversity of opinions that you gain from interviewing your participants are grouped into a set of aligned perspectives. So you're effectively grouping people into types or with similar viewpoints. So first of all, you go about this by creating a set of motivation statements, and those are created by working with beekeepers to see what is important to them, what should be included, looking at blogs and things like that to answer this question. What should be the statements to answer this question? As a beekeeper, I do what I do because, and some of the ones are because I enjoy it, or I need to generate an income, I like the hands-on nature of beekeeping, I do what I do because I have a responsibility to ensure diseases don't spread, or I want to help honeybee conservation, all of these type of things. There were 43 statements here, which formed the basis of doing the work with the beekeepers. Then we interviewed 21 beekeepers. Now 21, I can see Lars up there, doesn't sound like a big sample size, certainly not for a biologist, but for social sciences, this is a pretty big sample size, and you get a really rich data set from these interviews. And they had a range of attributes, ranging from the ages of 20 to over 70, 10 female, 11 male, years of experience from 6 months to over 70 years. That's interesting. I don't know how that works. Number of colonies from 1 to over 130, and some of them self-defined as either natural beekeepers or black beekeepers, actually, in as much as I'm talking about Apis mellifera in that case. And what you do is you ask them to arrange our 43 motivation statements in a grid, with the ones they mostly agree with and the ones they least agree with in terms of why they do what they do. And then you do a statistical analysis of that grid. But at the same time, you are interviewing them about their management practice and taping that and then analysing it by the themes that they talk about. So this is the grid, and I have to say, I think 20 out of the 21 really loved doing this. It was a really great opportunity for them to think about why they do what they do. One of them said it was too constraining, so maybe we should have had more than 43 statements. But basically, they were asked to place these statements, and this was, I know you can't really read them in a lot of detail, the ones they most agree with about why they do what they do, and the ones they least agree with, and the ones they don't really care so much about in the middle. So you've got things like, in the middle there I've got, I don't see any need to change, I do what I do because I consider my impact of my beekeeping on wild pollinators was one of the questions, I do what I do because I like to be self-sufficient, there's all sorts of questions in there. And this is just one particular example of how a beekeeper laid them out. Most important to them was because I enjoy it and I find honeybees fascinating. And at the bottom, they disagreed with, I like to win awards, and they disagreed with, I'm restricted by the amount of time I have available. So this is a beekeeper who really loves it, really enjoys doing it, isn't restricted by time, and doesn't care about winning awards, okay? What we ended up with after the statistical analysis was 5 perspectives that came out of this. And you may identify with one of those very naturally, or you might feel, oh, I think I sit between those, and I'll talk about that fluidity in a minute. We had the conventional hobbyists, which were the majority, actually. We had, at the bottom up, the new conventional hobbyists, which are like conventional hobbyists, but they've been only keeping bees for 1 or 2 years, probably. That's how they seem to cluster in the statistics. We have the pragmatic bee farmers, we have the natural beekeepers, and we have in our region, we have black bee farmers, so people who are making an income out of rearing bees that are similar or as similar as they can be to Apis mellifera. Too many things to press. Okay, I don't expect you to read it. Here was all the statements here, and I'm going to move on swiftly from the slide, but I think it really helps. What you need to keep in mind is the 5 things: the conventional hobbyists, the natural beekeepers, black bee farmers, new conventional hobbyists, and pragmatic bee farmers. I'm going to use these acronyms throughout now. So in each of these lines down here is a typical example from that group and how they scored it, with green being they strongly agreed with the statement and red being they strongly disagree. And you can see there's some areas where all the groups thought pretty much the same thing. None of them agreed that it was a family tradition, or that's why they were doing it. And there's a green statement at the top. They all agreed that they enjoyed it to a more or lesser extent. But there's some areas where there's quite a lot of disagreement. This one, for example, whether they're restricted by time. This one is interesting. I want to fly my flag for my way of doing beekeeping. The natural beekeepers and the black bee farmers really strongly agreed with that statement, and the others didn't. So you can see how this starts to bring, I'm not going to say separate the beekeepers apart, because that's quite a pejorative statement, but it starts to understand the different motivations as to why beekeepers do what they do. I'm going to summarise it in words now, so it's simpler to understand. So this is a sort of typical description. Conventional hobbyists are not restricted by time or income. I know these are generic, but this is what have came out of our 21 beekeepers. Not restricted by time or income. They like an autonomous approach. They follow official advice to keep their bees healthy, maintain their hobby, and address responsibilities towards other beekeepers and wildlife. Some agreement with natural beekeeping ideas, but wanting to prevent disease spread and ideally produce honey, preventing them from changing their management practices. The new conventional hobbyists have restricted time. They practice as they've been taught, and they aim to keep their bees healthy and minimise disease spread. They generally follow official or management advice, but strong desire to allow their bees to behave as naturally as possible is traded off with their sort of personal, economic and social responsibilities. So they're feeling a bit more uncomfortable with this constraining bees in a box than the conventional hobbyists, basically. The natural beekeepers aim to conserve the honeybee for environmental reasons. Their management differs from official advice generally, and they're not limited by time, finance, or desire in this particular subset to retain their bees, nor particularly by disease spread. The motivation to let bees behave and reproduce naturally are prioritised over personal or economic motivations. The black bee farmers need to generate an income from their bees and are driven by the conservation of Apis mellifera mellifera and keeping locally bred honeybees. They generally follow official management advice, and their personal, economic and social responsibility and ideological motivations, and in the social scientific format, Apis mellifera mellifera was considered as an ideology. Actually, that's just the phrase that is used in the Q methodology. Consideration of wild pollinators was ranked the lowest in this particular group. Pragmatic bee farmers need to generate an income, restricted time, and are distinguished by a lack of affiliation with natural or black bee perspectives. They follow official management advice. Personal, economic, and social responsibility motivations are prioritised. So some of you might be looking at this saying, oh yeah, no, that's obvious. Why did you do all that work to get that? And some of you might be saying, no, but some of that isn't quite right. I self-identify as a new conventional hobbyist, but I don't feel quite that way. Well, that's okay. This is just a way of opening the debate and seeming to understand or think about other people's perspectives. This table says the same thing, but it pulls together the things that the different perspectives agreed with. So conventional hobbyists and new conventional hobbyists found them fascinating. They wanted to minimise bee stress, current colony health, and the new conventional hobbyists more strongly wanted their bees to behave, in quotes, naturally. You can see this minimised bee stress comes out with all of the perspectives, I'm pleased to say, but the way that they do it is different. So that's what I'm going to come on to in a moment. The next slide, with the red, just shows what these particular perspectives disagreed with. So what they all pretty much agreed to disagree with was none of them wanted to win any awards. The pragmatic bee farmers maybe. And the new ones maybe aspired, because they didn't have it as a negative anyway. And these are more the agreements. Interestingly here, new conventional hobbyists didn't want to fly the flag for their practice, and that was only really seen in the black bee farmers and the natural beekeepers. Pragmatic bee farmers were very strongly disagreeing with genetically pure black bees, and they disagreed with the statement that chemicals will reduce genetic fitness in their hive as well. So that, I think, is interesting. Perhaps not surprising, but it's interesting to see it laid out. But there was great fluidity between the perspectives. So these radar plots here have mapped each of the beekeepers onto the different perspectives. So for the conventional hobbyist, you expect, if they're most closely aligned with that perspective, they should all have the highest, they should all be honed in on that point there, if you like. And the natural beekeepers, this is the perspective, the area where they should all hone in. But what you can see is that the stretching out from the centre means that some of them are aligning with other perspectives in some areas of their practice or what they agree and disagree with. Okay? And most interviewers didn't necessarily neatly fall into one category. So let's go on to management practice and how their motivations change their management practice. Well, it's true that motivations can be shared across perspectives, but how you think about the trade-offs and what their motivations might be shared, but how that is delivered in practice can be different. And some of that is counter to what we're calling official UK advice, which is from the National Bee Unit, which says inspect your colonies every 7 to 10 days, treat for varroa mites, manage your swarms. There is no official maximum stocking density on the NBU website, but I'm guessing these are quite similar to the BBKA advice, or what would be kind of advised if you're keeping stocks of bees. Of course, if you don't necessarily follow this advice, the thought is that that may have implications for wild pollinator health and competition. So reduced inspections, no varroa management or no swarm management might result in disease spread, either to other honeybee colonies or to wild bees, and there is some scientific evidence for that. There is also some scientific evidence that stocking rates can affect the competition for foraging areas as well. So there are different considerations there that need to be taken into account. So what did we find? All of them, in their interviews, had similar motivations. I do what I do because I want to minimise stress and suffering to my bees. But what we find is that means that everyone except the natural beekeepers did inspections every 7 to 14 days, or at least when they could. The hobbyists, conventional or new, wanted to keep healthy bees and minimise swarming so they don't lose them for their bees' welfare and to minimise disease spread. The black bee farmers and the pragmatic bee farmers wanted the above, but also to generate an income, either for their livelihood in terms of the bee farmers or for their conservation project if it was about the black bees. The natural beekeepers, much more limited internal inspection. External, they would have a look every day, they'd peek in once a month and only do a full if they felt it was needed. They did this because they were trying to minimise stress on their bees as well, but from a different perspective. And therefore minimise disease as well. Long-term honeybee conservation of the population of honeybees was ranked above personal, practical or shorter-term stewardship of the individual colony. And I think this quote from one of the conventional hobbyists sort of sums that up. In some ways, if I wanted to minimise stress and suffering, I probably wouldn't inspect them, which is what the natural beekeepers do. But one of the main reasons I do inspect every week is to prevent swarming, also to recognise if they're hungry or suffering. So there's this kind of balance, what is least stressful to your bees, and people come out on different sides of that. So beekeepers are balancing these trade-offs between their different responsibilities to their bees, to themselves, and whether they've got to get an income or not, to other beekeepers, and what their management is likely to mean for other beekeepers, and to the environment and the wild pollinators. This was about Varroa management, and you can see this figure if you look at the paper, but basically, most of the groups came out as treating for Varroa or treating when needed for Varroa for different reasons. The hobbyists, mostly because they had a responsibility to ensure Varroa and viruses didn't spread, and they were worried that their bees would die. The farmers did it more because, again, they want to keep strong, healthy bees for their income. The natural beekeepers were not treating for Varroa with synthetic chemicals because they wanted to facilitate long-term adaptation and increase genetic fitness of the honeybee, and they thought the chemicals might affect the honey. And there were those in the middle who treated as minimally as possible. So there's gradations in all of these. And here's a few quotes on Varroa management. The natural beekeeper saying, some say we increase infections, but I feel manipulations weaken the colony, leading to winter losses. Conventional hobbyists said, I wish I didn't use Varroicides. I wish I was braver, but I don't want to let my bees die because they're good bees. And the pragmatic bee farmer says that in that we shouldn't treat, it's not necessary. That's probably a good thing, but it would involve counting Varroa load in every apiary, and you need time. I need to think about cost effectiveness. So you can see how these practices have developed. But the recurring theme that comes out of this is the difference between whether the beekeeper is focusing on long-term honeybee conservation of populations or on current colony health. The hobbyists, conventional and new conventional, and the bee farmers rank current colony health above long-term honeybee conservation. The natural beekeepers and the black bee farmers rank long-term honeybee conservation above current colony health to allow the honeybee to experience those environmental stresses that may facilitate adaptation. I'm not going to go through this slide because I might run short of time a bit, but it pretty much says the same thing, that you can see here that those that ranked the motivation to minimise disease spread highest, the beekeepers and the farmers, are the ones who treated most often for Varroa, and those who ranked it lowest didn't treat, and those who ranked conservation of honeybees over the longer term highest were the ones who didn't treat as well. So that shows that long-term versus colony, sort of individual colony in year health difference as well. Interestingly, wild pollinator conservation wasn't prioritised by any of them, really. So honeybee conservation emerged as a key motivator for pretty much everyone. And this is, I can let you read some of those quotes themselves, but most of them said, well, I don't think I consider it really, although they did say as being a beekeeper, it had made them more considerate of other pollinators, so that's great. This blue one from the new conventional hobbyist is interesting. At the beginning, I didn't know much about other kinds of bees at all. I didn't know much about honeybees, in fact. So the more you learn, the more you become aware of these problems, and you're not saving the world by keeping honeybees. You might actually be doing harm. I thought that was an interesting quote. And there's a point here where the pragmatic bee farmer is agreeing with the natural beekeeper, actually, because their quote, to summarize, is that actually, because honeybees are foraging on different flowers from some of the wild pollinators, then they're not going to impact on the wild pollinators. So this is very interesting to me as a bumblebee ecologist. This is very interesting. Opinions around scientific research. I think it's irresponsible not to pay attention to scientific research. I'm very interested in scientific research. I go along more with what I find to work rather than what the science says. I keep bees, it's my hobby. I'm not interested in the science. I'm not scientific. Right now, I want to look after my bees, but there's a grand scientific scheme. That's basically, most beekeepers didn't really worry much about the science. They were a bit frustrated by it, which I get, okay. Sometimes science doesn't give enough information as to how they arrived at that decision. You just expect me to believe it. Well, no, I don't. So that told us. And I love this last one, and I've got Lars in the audience here. There's research showing you can make a bumblebee play football, and you think, why? Where's the use in that? We just got to keep on fiddling with nature all the time. So I didn't know you were going to be up here, Lars. But I think this is interesting, and this is about actually how it's we as scientists can get across the point of why we're doing some of this research. So the conclusions, 21 beekeepers showed a variety of personal, practical, financial and environmental motivations, and we were super happy that they were involved in this. The perceived extreme viewpoints were actually very rare. They were all along a continuum. And the logical premise behind natural beekeeping and letting your bees behave more naturally was shared across group, but shorter-term responsibilities were prioritised in terms of how you practice. So this key contrast between the motivations to keep colonies alive and the motivation to conserve honeybee populations was the clearest difference. And this is my personal view, that I think part of this is just telling us that our relationship with honeybees sits somewhere between managing them as livestock and caring for them as wild animals. And it's where you are on that spectrum that may affect your practice. And sometimes you might be quite conflicted by that, actually. Okay, this is going to see if any of you have responded to the survey. Okay, so we've had 23 plus 9, 32 responses of how many colonies. So mostly small beekeepers in the audience, but up to 100 colonies and somebody who doesn't have any, which is great. How long have you been beekeeping? Oops, sorry. Most more than 10 years in the audience. That's interesting, but a few variable. Perhaps you can see why I was asking these particular questions. Do you manage your colonies to control for Varroa? Most people say yes every year who are in this audience, and it was the audience from yesterday as well for my talk, because I gave them the passcode. Yes, when required, is about a third there. I didn't know how these were going to come out. And somebody says that they don't. So this is a BBKA convention, actually. So I'm not surprised that there's more people treating for Varroa in here than we had in our particular sample, where there were possibly more of the natural beekeeper style. And what's your main motivation for keeping bees? I didn't know how this was going to come out. Interest and fascination comes right up the top. Being close to nature comes right up the top. Producing wax and honey, boosting pollination. Oh, socialising with beekeepers. I thought that might be higher at the convention, actually, because I thought it might be the ones who really wanted to socialise who'd come out. Conserving honeybees, relatively low, and generating income. So this is you. This is, this is your motivations. I think that's quite interesting, and thank you for taking part. The final one is the one question. Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so what have we got here? Most people prioritise the health and survival of their bee colonies. So I'm guessing most of the people who've answered this are in the conventional hobbyist or new conventional hobbyist kind of perspective that we've been talking about. Although we have some people here, we have 4 people here who prioritise long-term conservation of honeybee populations, and these different colours are whether they treat for Varroa or not. So as expected, a beekeeper who does, or some beekeepers who don't, well it must be one beekeeper who doesn't treat for Varroa is coming out in that category where long-term conservation of honeybees is the most important thing. So, and then we've got 3 here who are prioritising productivity. So that's great and means that our survey wasn't totally off the mark, I think. So the Q methodology was well received, and almost all of them enjoyed it, and they found it very useful for self-reflection, and I'm super thankful for them for taking part, actually. I don't know who the beekeepers were, by the way. Faye knows who they were, but she wouldn't even share the names with me. She is super careful about data protection. So even if you ask me afterwards, I can't tell you who they were. All beekeepers felt it was important to be open to change, which was great, and to think about other perspectives. The participants' research questions, when we asked them about science, actually matched our own scientific interests. How long do feral bees survive in the wild? What's their Varroa load? What's the local significance of Varroa and disease spread to wild pollinators? Significance of forage competition. So that's good. We've all got some key aims where scientists and beekeepers can come together a bit more. It's true that one of the main results that's come out of this for me is that scientists must question their own biases and how their research questions are framed. And this idea about scientific knowledge, experience-based knowledge, and more sort of tacit knowledge is super important. And we must not assume that just because it's a scientist standing up to talk to you that we've got all of the answers. It must be two-way at least. I've learnt most of what I know about honeybees and beekeeping from the late, great Peter Tompkins, who was the beekeeper at Rothamsted for many years. And that's probably partly why I'm still up here today, actually, because of him and what he's taught me. I recommend you have a look at this particular paper if you're interested in beekeepers' knowledge and how that can be brought into wider policy and participation in pollinator conservation. And so this is where it comes to actually, as a collective of scientists and knowledgeable beekeepers and other people interested in pollinators, we need to collaborate to understand those different perspectives and experience to come up with what sustainable beekeeping might be. It could be any of the following, and some of you might agree with one or other of these, or several of them, or none of them, and have your own ideas. I'm not providing any answers here, but I really hope in the next few years we can have much more conversation about what sustainable beekeeping means. Is it about minimal disease? Is it about no importation or locally adapted bees? Is it about genetic resilience? Is it about economic sustainability? Sustaining low impact on the environment and other wild pollinators? Clearly the beekeepers we interviewed didn't think that was their most important thing, whereas coming from a background of studying wild pollinators, I imagine that might be higher in people's thoughts. Maybe it's about using sustainable equipment and reducing waste and the sort of circular economy of beekeeping. And of course, the cultural sustainability of a highly valued tradition, craft or skill. All of those things, probably. There's a very interesting video of Bees for Development debate on a sustainable bee framework for the beekeeping framework for the UK, which is on YouTube. And when you see you can, if you just put in Bees for Development debate at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, you'll pull up that YouTube link. And of course, once this film is online, you'll be able to see that link as well. That's it from me. Thanks to the Halpin Trust, the CB Dennis Trust and the BBKA for inviting me today. And thanks particularly to Jess, Faye and Ben for letting me discuss their research today. And I hope you found it interesting and not too controversial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and thank you once again to the CB Dennis Trust as well for sponsoring today's lecture. Now, are there any questions? And we'll have the roving mics go round. There's somebody up at the back up there. So I think the first question is about whether there are differences between beekeepers and non-beekeepers in their reasons for being involved in it, and whether they are more or less frightened of things like being stung.
Are they brave?
Are they brave?
Being different. Is it because they like to be different from the norm, which is where people are scared of being stung? Yes, thank you, Joyce, and thank you for that question. We didn't ask that question, but I'm going to note that down, because I think as Faye goes forwards and thinks about the motivation for beekeeping, any other statements that we can include in that type of approach, which might be about, actually, I do something a bit different. I'm different from the usual population because I'm being brave or working with an organism which most people wouldn't go near. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. So thank you for that input.
This is more a question to myself and probably for discussion, but my background is mental health, and something I've noticed since I've started keeping bees, and I'm definitely a newbie, is that it's really good for relieving stress, because you have to slow down, you have to calm down. And I would actually sell that as a motivator to a lot of people thinking of taking up beekeeping. I just wondered about your opinion.
I think that's a brilliant point that we should bring into our future analysis. I don't think it was specifically a question. There might have been a question, is I find it relaxing, actually. I know that if I go out into a bee colony, you have to be calm. It's like doing yoga practice, actually. For me, it feels a bit like the sense I get from when I do yoga as well. And so yes, I think it makes a difference. I guess the only way we got close to that in the questions we asked the audience was being close to nature, but that doesn't really address the point that you're making, that it actually changes how your hormones are working when you're doing it. So thank you, that's a really good point.
I wonder if that is actually not necessarily a prime motivation that people realise initially. I wonder if it's something they realise once they're doing it.
Right.
Perhaps
something they gain from
that,
experience.
Yes. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, going back to one of your earlier slides that showed the media coverage over the last 20 or so years, what caused the spike in 2013?
Yeah, interesting. I don't know, actually, because I'd have to look at the detail of what those were. Jess or Ben might have looked at that more closely. It's about bee decline, so there must have been a paper that came out. Yeah, so colony collapse was a little bit earlier, perhaps, but there must have been a paper that came out in 2012, I would guess, or a report that came out that stimulated that on bee decline.
I think Tim Lovett has something to contribute.
Oh, the pollinator initiative! I missed the point, Tim. Sorry.
I was bound to say this, wasn't I? But in 2005, the BBKA started campaigning when post foot and mouth we were going to lose a lot of our bee inspectors. Everybody had to cut back. And then, of course, we got that one sorted, and the minister agreed not to cut that, which was one win. And then CCD began to come onto the horizon. We became very aware that there was very little money being spent on research. People like yourself, Juliet, were being chased out of research positions. There just wasn't any money going in, and we started the campaign, which was massively operative in 2010, 2011. We saw a huge takeoff in membership, aside an unintentional benefit of that campaign, and it has gone on from there. And of course, industry, everybody wants to green up, and it just took off from there. So I think the BBKA can claim a little credit and as being a causative agent in that.
I think Tim is right. The BBKA can claim some credit for that in 2012, and partly because they pressured the government into putting £10 million into pollinator projects, which kicked off in 2011, I think. And so there was a lot of news coverage coming out of governments as well as from the BBKA and other organisations sort of around that. So that wouldn't be surprising if that was part of the spike. Thank you.
Yeah, as beekeepers, there's so many constructive themes to crafts and skills that we have, and the public are aware of it, but are we missing a trick? Are there things that we're doing that we should advertise more broadly to the public?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I'd sort of like to hear what beekeepers think of that. But yes, I mean, a lot of beekeepers keep in as sustainable way as they can. They reuse equipment, they clean and reuse. They do as the bees do in a way. You know, bees will reuse their their wax and their propolis and their honey. It's a circular economy effectively inside the hive. And beekeepers, a lot of beekeepers work in that sustainable way and have those skills in whether it's in woodwork or in putting hives together or in how they manage things, which actually are kind of under the surface, really. We don't often get under the hood and think about how beekeepers do their craft. So that's a really good point, I think.
Yeah. Yes, and I suppose as well, thinking about the other skills that often go along with beekeeping, there's a lot of people with woodworking skills and that sort of thing, other skills like that as well. Yes,
and
yes,
food production
yes,
and all of the
yes,
rest of
yes,
it, and
yes,
bottling, so
yes,
you're absolutely
yes.
right. And they're not necessarily prioritised in kind of showing what beekeeping is about and all the different, you know, you've got to be a polymath, you've got to understand and do everything, haven't you, when you're a beekeeper? And that doesn't necessarily come across. Good point.
Are there any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? And if not, it really remains for me to thank Juliet once again. Thank you very much for your lecture. Can we all show our appreciation?